morning, everyone, and welcome to another KZN Top Business Masterclass. Today, we're delighted to have Nikita Pillay with us, who's the head of HR compliance at DRG. She is very well experienced in the field and has a lot of information and advice to offer us. Employees in South Africa are among the most protected in the world, and with this comes a very safe working environment. However, employees need to understand all the different elements that make up workplace legislation. And so we're very grateful to have Nikita to take us through this process. Thank you so much, Nikita. We'd like to hand over to you.
Thank you, Gail. That's been a fabulous introduction. It's amazing to be here today. And we welcome all of our online audience. So it's so good to have you. I hope that I do justice to the session and that you take away something of relevance that you can use, in your everyday work or organization. So just to give you, I'm going to share my screen quickly. So okay, there we go. So I'm going to just give you a little bit of insight into the DRG team. So we are a very small team of specialists and a team that actually strives for excellence. The pillar within our organization is David White, who has created a well-known, reputable brand internationally as well as locally. We provide HR business partner services to many clients, to SMEs, to corporates. We pride ourselves in terms of our employer of record services, which is also known as our PEO services, which stands for Professional Employer Organization. We have extended the services and engaged with 40 international countries. Some of our other services that we do provide is payroll, HR and compliance, as well as leadership and mentorship. So without giving you, well, we have an awesome agenda prepared for you today. It looks quite long, but I'm going to try and keep it as concise as possible due to time constraints. But we are going to cover most of the aspects in terms of HR and IR. Let's start from the beginning without giving you a history lesson. So where it actually stems from is that, as we all know, we have an SA constitution that dictates various types of laws to our country. In that SA constitution, we have plenty of employment laws, and the list is immense. It's your basic conditions of employment, your Labor Relations Act, your Employment Equity Act, the UIF, Skills Development, BEE, as well as OSH Act. So these acts have dictated to employers to create a work environment that has fair labor practices, no discrimination, and provides a safe workplace for all staff. Let's jump to foundational documents. So there are many foundational documents, and sometimes when you ask organizations, where's your foundational documents, they would just probably give you your policy manual, your disciplinary code, and that is it. But there are many foundational documents. It actually starts off with your policy and procedure manual, which helps the organization as well as the employees understand what are the rules and the regulations of the company. Your disciplinary code of conduct is a very concise document that contains misconducts as well as the penalties attached to that. Your industry government regulations are those that are governed by the Department of Labor and your bargaining councils. So certain industries, for example, engineering or metal industry for that matter, has specific rules and regulations, and those become your industry governed regulations that any employer in those industries needs to abide by. Your employment contract is a very important foundational document. This helps employees understand their terms and conditions of employment when employed within an organization. Your onboarding, you may think it's just, well, giving them a contract and letting them sign it. it doesn't work that way. It's your onboarding comprises of many documents that you need to make sure is in the employee file, like your take-home documents, which is actually your personal the employee's personal information document, the ID, the bank account details, and other documents that needs to be put in there for relevance. Job descriptions are very basic as well. It provides knowledge to the employee to understand what is required of them, but in a very basic format. Induction of staff is very important, that you have a template of the induction of staff and that you tick off that all of these are being covered. Induction of staff helps them understand all of these documents that we are speaking about, the policy manual, the disciplinary code, their terms and conditions of employment within the employment contract. Training and development is very important as well, because it's actually the employee's responsibility to make sure that an employee receives sufficient training and development at the start of their employment that helps them understand and be able to for them to do the functions that they are required to do. They would know their roles and responsibilities. Exiting of employees is also an important foundational document. In terms of exiting of employees, it's important because you would want to know why an employee is leaving your employment. So an exit interview can be conducted as part of the process. It helps employees to understand why an employee is leaving, how could they have retained the employee, and well, any organization invests in an employee. So finding out, the training and development part of it, you have invested in the employee. So you would not want to lose an employee based on, certain circumstances, because you have already costed that out. Exiting of employees also means completing documents upon termination, such as the UIF document, the exiting in terms of their benefits, their provident, their medical aid, and making sure there's a smooth transition. So all of those documents form part of your foundational documentation. In terms of your registrations, so whenever an organization is created, the company needs to register with SARS in terms of their being provided with a company registration number or a CK number, as well as with the Department of Labor. So with SARS, you would need to register for employee taxes, which is your PAYE, STL, and UIF. Your Department of Labor, you need to register for UIF, COIDA, as well as for employment equity reporting purposes. Department of Labor's UIF, you have to register your employees so they are able to claim benefits at the time of exiting an organization. COIDA, in order to make sure that that you have a registration number in order to put claims through. Your employment equity reporting, designated employers need to register in order to submit the EEA2, EEA4 reports, but I'm going to go into more detail on that in a short while. In terms of SARS, it's called employee taxes, whereby a registration needs to happen at inception of creating an organization, where you register for PAYE, SCL, and UIF. Those are deductions that are made from payroll, which is actually paid over to SARS on a monthly basis. So the importance of induction and orientation of employees. This is a very important function. It helps to introduce the employees to the business, to help understand the goals and the direction of any organization, and to see how the employee actually fits into the organization. It helps them understand the culture and the practices, and introduces them to the foundational documents that we've discussed, which is the policy manual, the disciplinary code, their employment contract, as well as they're provided with training during their induction. They're able to understand what is required from them, and how do they go about, providing these tasks to the employer. They also need to be aware that, training and development is tracked. It normally happens during their probation period, but I'm going to go into a bit more detail in a short while. So understanding the probationary period, there has been a misconception on the probationary period where employers believe that it is for their benefit. It doesn't work that way. The probationary period is there to help the employee to understand their duties. It's the employer's responsibility to be able to track and manage these employees' performance. The employer needs to coach, mentor, and support the employee and provide meaningful feedback at regular meetings, regular performance meetings, to help the employee understand what's required, and if they're underperforming, to be able to manage the process going forward. Employment contracts, these are very important documents that are signed at employment of any employee. So we have three types of contracts. The first one is your full-time employment contract. This actually refers to your employees that are employed Monday to Friday or Monday to Saturday, that work a 40 or 45-hour week. So all of these contracts contains terms and conditions that are in your basic conditions of Employment Act. But however, these are very concise clauses that are included within the contract, and it's expanded into your policy manual. So what actually happens is, in these contracts, you would state that kindly refer to the policy manual for an expanded version. For example, you may have a company vehicle that is being loaned to an employee. However, you cannot include all of those clauses and terms and conditions in your employment contract. Your employment contract is supposed to be very concise. So your employment contract should actually make reference to your policy manual and state, kind of refer to the policy manual, where an expanded version is included therein. This may also cover like areas that is impossible to actually put into your employment contract, like liability, your insurance, your fines, who is responsible for all of that. So all of those are whatever clauses that appear in your employment contract is actually expanded into your policy manual. The other type of contract that we have is the project-based contract, where an employee could be employed for a specific reason to work on a certain project. So your employment contract would actually define what the project is, and it would have a start date and a termination date. So everyone would understand that that employee is working on a specific project for a specific period of time. Your fixed term contract is also has a start date and a termination date, and it's for specific reasons as well. It may be because you may require a seasonal worker for a period of 2 months, or some employee has gone on maternity leave, so you need to employ someone for that 3 or 4 months. There could be various other reasons why you need to employ someone on a fixed term contract. However, it's not ideal to continuously renew the fixed term contract, as it creates a perception of continued employment, and eventually constitutes to a permanent employment of the employee. You also need to be aware that in a fixed term contract, if an employee is employed for more than 23 months and earns below the threshold that makes them entitled to severance pay after that 23 months of employment. Okay. Sorry. So job descriptions, it's a very concise document which helps the employee to understand what is required from them in terms of their roles and responsibilities. As the position evolves, your job description normally gets updated. And as the position transitions, you relook at the roles and responsibilities contained therein. Okay, so salary benchmarking, it's a very complex process which requires the assistance of specialists. It's actually an analysis of the position which leads to assessing salaries against the market. So it's a comparison of pay practices to those in the market by benchmarking all of the elements of remuneration. So your remuneration actually comprises of fixed and variable salaries for unique roles based on your specific company matrix. It's a bit of a complex process, so there's a lot of detail that actually goes into it. In terms of job grading, it's actually grading of a similar or same position into into respective grades that determine fairness in terms of salary brackets. So grading is there to encourage a more equitable and fair working conditions, grouping jobs of the same level with the same skills and ensuring a similar pay bracket for each grade. So one of our hot topics is actually disciplinary processes, and every organization needs to apply this. It actually starts off with your disciplinary code of conduct, which I had mentioned earlier on, which is one of your foundational documents. So based on that document that contains misconducts and proposed sanctions, some of the sanctions could actually be warnings. It could be a final warning, or it could lead straight into a disciplinary hearing. So your warnings are normally valid for 6 months at a time, with the exception of your final written warning, which could be valid for 12 months. An employee that commits a serious misconduct could receive a final written warning, although he may not have received previous warnings. But depending on the severity of the misconduct, it could head straight into into a disciplinary hearing. So a disciplinary hearing is has to be a very precise process, because there are lots of niggly areas that need to be attended to. For example, the time frame of serving an employee with a notice, which needs to be minimum 48 hours. An employee needs to understand their rights prior to going into a disciplinary hearing. Some of those rights are: do they have an employee representative? Are they being represented at the hearing? Do they require an interpreter? Have they been provided with a minimum 48-hour notice? And there's various other questions that go with that. You know, are they union members? Because if they are, a different process needs to be followed in terms of a shop steward, that is. An independent chairperson is allocated to a disciplinary hearing that actually listens to both sides of the case, listens to the employee, listens to the employer, and whatever evidence is presented by both parties, the chairperson takes that into consideration and provides a sanction to the employee. Performance hearings, this is very important, because performance hearings also has a process to follow before you actually go into a performance hearing. So meetings need to be held with the employee. Then the employer needs to show that they have coached, managed, and supported the employee throughout a performance management process. In the event that the employee has not performed to a sufficient standard, then it would result in the in the employer arranging for a performance hearing, which is similar to a disciplinary hearing where the chairperson would actually be a neutral person, unbiased person, who would look at both sides of the performance hearing. You know, how has the employer supported the employee, and is there anything that the employee wishes to, you know, present? And based on what is presented at a performance hearing, the chairperson actually decides on an appropriate sanction. Sanctions could be termination, or maybe the chair decides, well, maybe allow the employee another month of performance management before deciding on an outcome. In terms of grievance and a harassment process, these need to be outlined in your policy manual, due to the fact that there's various line managers, line management, various stages in the grievance and harassment process that needs to be adhered to. For example, raising a grievance against, for example, your line manager. You would not obviously go to your line manager to report the grievance. You need to go to someone that you feel comfortable consulting with and, you know, chatting about. So in your policy manual, you need to make sure that you have a clear grievance process that is outlined, and employees need to be aware of all of these processes. That normally happens at induction or, you know, training along the line to help employees understand, you know, the line managers, which way to go, understand the processes, and at what stage they would receive an outcome in terms of, you know, when raising a grievance, and what's the time frame. So compliance reporting is very important because there are two important compliance reporting, such as your employment equity reporting. So you may have heard the term designated employers. What it actually means is that employers that employ more than, well, 50 and more employees, and or have exceeded the Schedule 4, the turnover, annual turnover stated in Schedule 4 of the Employment Equity Act. So if an employer meets those, it is their responsibility to register on the Department of Labor and be able to submit reports in terms of employment equity. So these reports are actually your EEA2, your EEA4, and what the report actually contains is, in your EEA2, is your workforce, as well as the movements, such as terminations, recruitment, promotions. The Department of Labor wants to actually see those statistics for a specific period. It also requires for you to advise the Department of Labor of any barriers and affirmative actions that have been put into place to address any barriers that the organization may have. It also requires for a time frame to be stipulated and who's responsible for those activities. In addition to the EEA2, we have the EEA4, which is a report containing salaries of your organization. It goes further into asking the employer various questions, like what is the top 10% of your salaries, your median, as well as your top and your bottom 10% of your employment salaries, and how are you willing to, or how are you able to close the gaps in those salaries. Now, we may know that it's virtually impossible to close the gaps because we have different levels, occupational levels, and salaries will differ in each of those occupational levels due to the length of service of an employee or experience. So there are various reasons that we need to justify to the Department of Labor as to why we are unable to close that gap. Also, the Department of Labor requires for the company to have a remuneration policy centered around these discrepancies and how you are, going to fix it, and going forward, how is remuneration within your organization determined? We have the work skills plan, as well as the annual training report, which is also known as your WSP ATR. So these are reports which are provided to the various SETAs. Your SETAs are actually determined via SARS, so you need to actually check if you have not registered for submission. You want to register. You need to find out from SARS which industry you have been allocated to. You would register via the department. You would register with the SETA, and you would submit your training report. So what it actually contains is that you need to provide training records to, for the past year. You need to show the SETA who have you trained in the past year, and a projection of who you're going to train in the next year. Just for submitting these reports, the SETA gives you back 20% of your SDL that you have contributed for the year. These are paid out to you in tranches, which could be a collated amount based on, for every 3 or 4 months. So it's more an incentive that is provided to employers just to register and submit a report on training. Employees are also allowed to apply for discretionary grants. The 20% is actually known as mandatory grants, whereas you can apply for discretionary grants where the SETA provides funding to you, but you need to actually apply for that. There's no guarantee that you would receive it, but they would fund your training depending on their plan. Okay. So HR and HR audits, compliance audits, there are so many different types of audits that can be conducted within an organization. Sometimes when you speak of audits, people just think, well, it's just financial audits, the normal audits that happen every year, but no, there's a lot of different types of audits that can be conducted. Your employee personnel file. Basically what that audit entails is making sure that all of the relevant documents are in that employee file, because if ever you are audited, for example, by the Department of Labor, they want random files and they pull out maybe 5 or 10, depending on the size of the organization. And they want to make sure that all of the employee relevant documents are contained therein. The employment contract, which needs to be signed by all parties, the ID document, the take-on form, bank account details, those are all important documents that need to be in every employee's file. Your payroll audit is an audit to make sure that you are being compliant in terms of SARS requirements for taxes, that benefits are calculated accordingly, that the method of calculations in the background of your payroll system is correct. It goes on into a lot of detail. Records retention is a requirement where records need to be maintained by an organization, depending, like for example, SARS requires documents to be retained for a period of 5 years or 7 years. And so you just need to make sure that you are retaining records, archiving them correctly. So if ever there's an audit, you have your records from the past years. Recruitment and hiring audit. What this actually means is that in terms of your recruitment, you need to make sure you have tracking of, for example, the candidates' CVs, the panel interviews, the panel that interviews them. There needs to be a record of that. You need to make sure that if there were questions asked, it's documented, and what was the feedback provided by the candidates. You need to have a track record of how and why the candidate was selected. So you would probably interview 10 candidates, but you need to make sure that you justify why the 1 or 2 candidates were selected. So your recruitment actually holds all of those relevant information. Remuneration and reward speaks about salary, benefits, and how an employee is compensated. A justification in terms of why was remuneration increased? How was rewards provided? So you need to actually have a tracking system in that respect. An audit can be done at any point in time to justify why these adjustments were made. Employee benefits ties in with your payroll as well as your remuneration. A benefits audit to make sure that all employees are receiving the same benefits. There's no discrimination, there's no unfair practices. Looking at the benefits that are provided to employees and that they're fair. Employment equity audit is just what we've spoken about, employment equity reporting, but the Department of Labor also does an audit in terms of making sure that designated employers are compliant. If you are not compliant, then I know that your employment equity is actually taken on a DG review. And it could go to court if you are being non-compliant, and you could be penalized in terms of a fine, which could result anything from 500,000 to 1.5 million, or even a percentage of your annual turnover. So that is how strict they are in terms of employment equity reporting and making sure you are compliant. So Department of Labor audit, I'm sure many of you may have seen this. These audits transpire where the inspector rocks up at your organization and asks you for documents, such as your employment contract, your EMPL ones, and your last payments, and your last payment for COIDA. They just want to make sure that you are being compliant in those respects. So that basically covers a lot of the HR aspects that is on our agenda. We have a DRG HR and Compliance articles booklet that is to be launched in later October. And the good thing is that it's at no cost to you. So our masterpiece is taking longer than normal. We thought we would have it launched today, but we've been experiencing a bit of hiccups. So later on in this month, if you require a copy of this, drop me an email and I will send you the copy as soon as it's ready. So that brings me to the end of our session. You have our contact details on the screen, so you're welcome to drop us an email. If you need anything, give us a call if you need any advice, and I'm sure we can help you. Thank you.
Thanks, Nikita. That was really multidimensional and very, very comprehensive. I see a couple of questions that have popped up. Do you have any tips of managing all these requirements on an annual basis? There's an awful lot. How would you go? Where would you start, and how would you check that over the year this has all been attended to?
I think you need to actually set yourself a calendar and make sure that, for example, your employment equity season starts from October or September, October, and continues to January. So during that time frame, you need to report for employment equity. Schedule that in September that we need to look at, equity. With the work skills plan and the training report, it starts. You need to report by the 30th of April. So start planning your reporting from January. It does take a lot of time because it's a lot of information that needs to be collated and captured onto the system, the SETA system as well. So plan yourself accordingly, not just when you are when an audit pops up. Try to have everything in order in advance, and it's important that you have processes and procedures throughout the year where you are able to collate documents so that when it comes time for an audit or the Department of Labor comes in, you already have everything in order.
And how do you best stay in touch with new requirements? Because they change all the time. How do you keep yourself up to date? What would you advise?
I would advise keeping abreast in terms of sessions like this, you know, where you get up to date with basic conditions of employment, the Labor Relations Act, Employment Equity Act. So there's, as time goes by, there's always transition, there's always updates that need to be done. So wherever there's workshops or online sessions, join them. You know, that's the only way for you to keep abreast of all of the laws and the requirements. Yeah.
And does DRG do audits? You mentioned, you gave us a long list of what could be audited. If you wanted to get ahead, how could you get somebody like you to come in and audit what you have?
So yes, DRG does all of those audits. It's just a matter of you contacting us, and we can arrange, you know, for those audits to be done. It is very important, a function in HR. Yeah.
I see a specific question in our Q&A. Disciplinary process. Verbal warning seems to be not included in the process. Do all warnings require a first warning instead of a verbal warning?
Your verbal warning is actually something like a counseling session. For example, sorry, an employee may be coming in 5 minutes, 10 minutes late, you know, for work, and you don't really want to issue a warning to that effect. It merely entails having a chat to the employee, finding out actually what's the reason, you know, behind that, and noting it as a counseling session or a verbal warning. Sometimes you don't need to receive a first warning or a second warning. You could, depending on the seriousness of the misconduct, you could just receive a final written warning. It all depends on what the conduct is. Sometimes you may not have received any warnings at all, but you have committed a very serious misconduct, and that could warrant a disciplinary hearing.
And you mentioned the policy and procedure manual, and that's that's your starting point. And you during your presentation, you also mentioned a couple of other things that should be in there. Do you have other specific points that need to be included, or essential rules and regulations that should be included in the policy and procedure manual?
Your policy and procedure manual normally ties in with your basic conditions of employment, as well as your terms and conditions that appear in your contract. So your contract should be a very concise document, but whatever terms and conditions apply, they are contained therein, should actually be expanded in your policy manual. So you could have policies such as your disciplinary policy, which highlights exactly what your warnings are, when it is issued, your disciplinary procedure, your performance management policy. You can have a company vehicle policy. There's lots of policies, but it has to tie in with your basic conditions of employment, as well as your terms and conditions that apply, you know, in your contracts.
Great, thank you. So and do you have a checklist that people could go to? You know, some kind of checklist that before they make sure that they have everything and go through it step by step to make sure that all of these different policies are in place?
We have a list of policies that are available. It covers 15 of the very basic policies that is aligned with your BCEA and your LRA. However, there isn't, well, you can expand on that, as I mentioned, but it's very important that you have the basic 15 policies. Yeah, but if you actually need a checklist and you need a list of what your policy manual should contain, drop me an email and I'll send it to you.
Great. And I mean, we've spoken a lot, and it seems from an HR, there's a huge amount of responsibility, and to be compliant. I think and as you also mentioned, that there are penalties if you're not compliant. But what about, I think people overlook the advantages. So just to recap, what do you think the advantages are of being compliant?
There's, well, I'll start off with penalties.
Yes.
There's lots of penalties and repercussions. If you are not compliant, SARS will come for you, the Department of Labor will come for you. The fines are exorbitant, and so it is very important, especially in a new organization, make sure your registrations are up to date. That's the first thing that you do. And then you create your foundational documents, which is actually forms the backbone of your company. It helps the organization as well as the employees to understand what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. So yeah, as your organizations grows, there's going to be different types of demands and registrations that would come up. There would be different types of requirements. So all is a tick box, complete the documents in order to be compliant. Yeah.
I also think it needs to be seen beyond a tick box exercise. So this enables your business to operate more effectively, efficiently. There's transparency. And you mentioned that there's a lot of explanation, a lot of justification. So if anyone questions anything, it's written, and you can explain the reasons for your decision. So it's an ongoing process as well, which in the end makes for a more effective business, and also allows a business to grow because the foundations are there, and it's just a matter of a constant applying and moving forward, basically.
Absolutely. You have, for example, your employment equity plan is a projection of your organization for the next 3 years or the next 5 years. So that helps to define your organization, where you are heading to. It gives direction. Same as your policy manual will give direction to the whole organization. Your disciplinary code gives direction to your employees in terms of, misconduct and what is acceptable and what is not.
And also the skills development reports as well, because it allows you to evaluate what skills are present in the organization and where your gaps are. So once more, it's not necessarily just submitting a report, but this is where we are and how can we move forward?
Absolutely. So the Department of Labor wants to have a look at how we are allowing employees to transition. How is our organization transitioning, and what's our plan going forward in that respect? So with all of our challenges of the past, it is important for us to show the Department of Labor that yes, and the SETA, that we have a plan in place, and this is how we are upskilling our employees.
Definitely. Thank you, Nikita. We've really covered a lot of information, and I think it'll be good to go back through and check that all of these things are active in our various organizations, because they certainly have, as you said, a lot of advantages, but then also penalties if they're not in place. And yeah. So I don't know if you have any final comments that you would like to make.
Yeah, I mean, the topics that I have spoken about today, it's just a limited number of aspects that I have actually focused on, but there are so much more when it comes to HR and to IR and being compliant. So I've touched on the most important aspects today, but it goes far more than what I have spoken about.
Yes, I think each topic is a webinar in itself, because they're very comprehensive topics, and we can certainly look at unpacking some of them going forward in the future as well.
Absolutely.
So I think we've covered, let me just check. I see one more question but just popped in. Let me just see what we have here. Is the employee supposed to keep a copy of the onboarding file?
Not necessarily, because it's actually the onboarding documents is actually your information. It's a copy of your ID, which you already have, your bank account statement or bank account details, which you already have. Your personal information document. So it's a template created by the organization, but you populate it with your personal information, like your next of kin, your medical information. So the organization knows who to contact, for example, in the case of an emergency. So that's your personal information. You wouldn't really require those documents. However, you would require a copy of your employment contract, which is signed off by both parties. It is ideal for you to have a copy of that, as well as your job description. But anything else in the onboarding is actually your information and employees' information, which they would already have.
Great. Thanks, Nikita.
It's a pleasure.
So I really appreciate your time today, and I'm quite sure that if anyone would like to contact you, your contact details, and they can get hold of you and go from there and unpack some of these issues further in their organizations.
Absolutely.
So I really appreciate your time. Thank
you.
you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Pleasure being here. Bye.
Bye.